Huckleberry Creek campfire song, hanging with the Sasquatch all night long. Leave peanut butter at your gift inside. Listen to the hoot and hollers all through the night. All through the night, and all through the night.
While I planned this to be a tongue-in-cheek type of epistle, something told with a bit of humor in it. And I think I achieved that end, but I'll have to leave it to you, the jurors, to determine if that goal was met. Suffice it to say that each anecdote related here is absolutely true. They happened as told. Believe me when I say they are much more humorous in retrospect than they were when I was immersed in the midst of them. Mean animals I have known. Once again, I find life in Hollywood to be at odds. In all the movies I've ever seen wherein animals are actually allowed to appear as themselves, in their real persona, and not some Disney-esque scenario where wild animals are portrayed as living in family groups with Papa Bear, Mama Bear, and Baby Bear, all living in harmony with their bunny and squirrel neighbors. The mean ones, if depicted at all, are conspicuously obvious. Who could but realize immediately upon seeing him that Shere Khan is up to absolutely no good and wishes nothing but evil to the man-cub in the Jungle Book? Even when actual animals are playing the part of animals, often with the help of plastic stand-ins, we are not allowed the honor of determining for ourselves the level of innate goodness embodied therein. Jaws, for example, could not make an appearance without being introduced with the blood-chilling rendition of some soul-tingling mood music. I know that one great shark bears a strikingly close resemblance to any other great white shark, much the same as one crow bears an exact resemblance to any other crow in the world. But that notwithstanding, did we need to be told that this creature was dangerous? Wouldn't the simple appearance of a tall fin jutting out of the water tell us his intentions? As a person who has spent a great percentage of his life among God's creatures, I can attest to anyone so inclined that no such warnings as those described above have ever preceded any close encounter of the malevolent kind among Mother Nature's children. Not once have I ever heard the tum-tum-tum-tum, tum-tum-tum-tum that Jaws engendered when approaching any critter that might wish me ill. In my single-digit and very early double-digit years, I spent well over 75% of the daylight and a substantial portion of the not-so-daylight hours when not serving time in that venerable institution that was the bane of my ilk, school, anywhere but under a roof. Much of this time was invested in exploring every square foot of my uncle's ranch and the surrounding environs. Fences held no meaning for me at this juncture and location, other than a necessary inconvenience meant to keep livestock restricted to a predetermined area. More or less, considering the shape in which most of these backcountry fences were kept. Many of them had been erected by the Spanish when General Mariano Vallejo had owned this vast Northern California domain and had seen little in the way of maintenance since that time. To say that most were decrepit would have been liberal in description. Actually, most were worse than that. As a consequence, this was pretty much open range to both the cattle and the sheep that grazed these timber and brushlands, as well as to small boys who were truly pint-sized disciples of Lewis and Clark, Kit Carson, and Jedediah Smith. But I digress. This ranch was home to about 4 or 5 million western timber rattlesnakes. Indeed, it seemed that these rattlesnakes were the only thing that did grow in profusion on this backwoods ranch. Now perhaps I've exaggerated a bit, but suffice it to say that they were common, and they grew large. I know that the official records say that this snake does not exceed 5 feet in length, but I could have shown those experts several specimens that exceeded that conservative length considerably. Probably the largest I ever saw was one my cousin Shirley killed under the clothesline just out back of the house. The snake measured over 6 feet in length without its head. The snake had a girth of over 8 inches and looked particularly menacing. For the most part, the only time we ever killed a rattlesnake is when it was in proximity to the house or could pose some danger to one of us. While I know that television tends to portray the rattlesnake in a coiled position, head poised to strike, and rattle singing, I actually saw that in the wild so rarely that I thought for many years that we had demented or at least unnatural snakes. Yes, when provoked, our snakes would coil and assume that classic pose. But it was an extremely rare circumstance for sure when a snake let forth with his singing buzz. Generally speaking, he had to be provoked heartily to induce that buzz. Normally, as soon as he was no longer being prodded or poked, he just uncoiled and slithered on about his rattlesnake business without so much as a by your leave or even a glance back, though he would probably have shaken his head and shrugged his shoulders had he had them at the ignominy of this treatment he had received. It should be noted that while I had no desire to attend one of their conventions or anything, I'm pretty much of a live and let live kind of guy. And if I happen on one of them on the trail, I'll just tip my hat and allow them to be on their way. The one notable exception to this rule occurred one spring day when Tony, our trusty and tired saddle horse, and I were returning from a morning's excursion to the edge of the wilderness, an area of immature madrone trees about 2 inches in diameter and 20 feet tall that had been killed in a fairly recent wildfire that had passed through the area. This created a nightmarish land of soot-covered stem, reminiscent of a black bamboo jungle. Only the foolish ever entered the wilderness a second time. On the morning in question, we had just made the trek for much the same reason people climb mountains, because they are there. It had been a pleasant foray, and had served to clear my mind of the cobwebs engendered during the previous week by Mr. Wilson, my 5th grade teacher, in his never-ending quest for dangling participles or split infinitives or something of the sort. The ride had worked wonders on my overtaxed nervous system, serving to remind me that if a noun wanted to dangle its gerund, it was by no means my fault. I was smiling inwardly and drowsing outwardly in the late morning sun. Tony, for his part, was taking it all pretty much in stride and was nearly as asleep as I was. The road we were on was no proper road, but merely a cat trail cut out by the massive blade of my uncle's venerable TD-24 bulldozer, built in the quest for the huge coastal redwood trees, Sequoia sempervirens, that grew there. These cat roads laced the mountainside, providing the foot-weary a fairly comfortable place to walk. They were, at least, brush-free and coated in about 6 inches or so of loose, flowing dust. The dusty trail was the morning newspaper of the mountainside. In it you could read the travels of the local denizens, deer, lizards, snakes, mice, skunks, raccoons, and weasels. They all left note of their passing for the alert reader. On this particular day, however, alert was not a word I would use to describe either Tony or myself. I was slumped in the saddle, nearly asleep in the suns, the reins wrapped loosely around the pommel. My feet were dangling on either side of the horse, free of the stirrups. All in all, it was about as pleasant a morning as a lad of my few years could have imagined, until we rounded a curve, and directly under Tony's belly a rather large rattler let out with a very loud and very penetrating buzz that immediately served to transform an idyll into a nightmare. I immediately recognized the sound for what it was, and, unfortunately, so did Tony. His immediate reaction, born of an innate, if heretofore unknown, dread of large rattlesnakes was to launch himself straight vertical for a considerable distance. I'll have to leave the exact altitude attained to one's imagination, as at that moment I was much too busy for quantitative research. Words my father had uttered only a week or so prior, on the occasion of my arriving back at the barn on Tony and being in the saddle but sound asleep, came to mind. Thomas, actually he called me Tommy, a habit I could not break him of his entire life. One of these days, something is going to spook him, and he's going to throw you so high, the crows will have time to build a nest in your behind. Actually, my dad's language being as colorful as it was, behind was not the exact word he used here, but you get the drift. Before you hit the ground. That, along with certain other predictions regarding the effects of my anatomy of some of my annex, served to suggest to me that he would have had a fair future as a prophet had he chosen to pursue that end. With maturity, something he could have gotten pretty long odds against in this era of my ever surviving long enough to reach, has come the realization that perhaps natural consequence may have had more to do with his prognostications than did any sense of the supernatural or ethereal. It amazes me, even today, more than a half-century later, how clearly these thoughts came to mind while I was still in the ascent stage and was diligently applying what I knew of, added to what I was learning of, the physics of flight, even while contemplating the inevitable. Somewhere below me was a crazed horse, and below him an angry, vociferous rattlesnake. Even though I was still gaining altitude at the moment of this thought, I knew that, eventually, gravity being what it was, I was going to have to effect a landing, although I was, at present, navigating quite well. I was not at all sure that such benevolent circumstances would long continue, let alone persevere. While time seemed to hang suspended, I could feel myself losing velocity as I neared the apogee of my short flight. Soon I felt the rush of air as my direction of flight reversed, and my velocity once more began to increase at a rate of, I was to learn many years later, 32 feet per second for every second of my descent. At this point, my thoughts begin to change from the esoteric investigation of non-powered flight to the entirely mundane. Where the hell, this being about the strongest language at my command at this time, is that snake? I must say, as Earth became larger and larger in my window of vision, much the same image as the Apollo astronauts would have had about a decade and a half later, that snake began to occupy more and more of my working mind. As the conjectural thoughts were pushed aside in favor of the essential, I began to detect, on the very periphery of my awareness, a loud, eerie screeching that seemed to fill the air with its essence. A small portion of my conscious thought was being hijacked by the weird sound. About this time, it dawned on me that of the three players in this incongruous drama, there was only one capable of generating that kind of output. As in the science of criminology, when the impossible is eliminated, what is left is probably the truth. So it was in this case. Neither horse nor snake was capable of that tone. Therefore, that left only me as the author of that sound. A fact that, while it did little to attenuate the volume, it did serve to remove one source of stress from my already tortured psyche. Now, there was only one prime thought remaining. Where the hell is that snake? Very soon, like the pilot said at his board of inquiry following the crash of his fighter plane, I ran out of airspeed, altitude, and ideas simultaneously. I found myself measuring my length in the deep dust of the road. As I lay prostrate, still wondering where that snake was, I could hear Tony making tracks as fast as he could down the mountain. He seemed nothing more than intent on putting as much distance as he could between himself and that snake, wherever he was, as possible in the shortest distance of time. As I lay there in the dirt, sucking the needles and leaves off nearby trees and shrubs in the effort to get air flowing into my lungs once more, I began to take stock of my anatomy. Without the benefit of mirrors or other paraphernalia, I made the assessment that everything seemed to be pretty much where it was prior to the ordeal, all of 3 seconds prior. The snake was not in evidence, having departed during the debacle just described. Tony was gone, but I had no concern for him. He knew the way back to the barn better than I did, and I had no doubt that I'd next see him when I got to the bottom of the mountain, standing at the gate, probably grumbling because he hadn't been fed yet. I spent a few minutes assessing my condition, testing my extremities, and in general wondering where the hell that snake was. Finally, having decided that little further could be gained from my present position, I tentatively began to rise. It was not the easiest task I have ever performed, but almost everything seemed to work fairly well, so timidly at first, but soon with more strength and purpose, down the road I moved. I was sure that Tony was gone, and that I was resigned to the long walk home on shaky and achy legs. About 3 curves down the hill, standing to one side of the skid road, was Tony. His reins were dangling, effectively ground hitching him and allowing me to catch up the reins, mount the saddle, and ride into the ranch yard in triumph. Head held high, rather than having to sorefoot it the last 2 miles in from the site of my encounter. My even more unkempt than usual condition and my rather labored movements finally clued my parents that all was not pure peaches and cream in my world. The severe interrogation to which I was subjected finally served to get the story of the meanest rattlesnake in all Northern California out of me, only to incite paroxysms of mirth from the entire family, parents, siblings, aunt and uncle and cousins, at my expense. Probably the meanest thing that snake did. And I never did figure out where he had gotten to. I was just extremely grateful that he was not still there when I arrived, returning from my aborted free flight. As usual with mean animals, there was absolutely no warning before he sang out in that especially loud voice, or tail in his case. In fact, it is precisely this proclivity in some animals to remain silent until I am entirely within their snare and am at peace with the world before launching their attack that marks them as particularly mean animals. One of the past masters of this subterfuge resides in the forested areas of the Pacific Northwest. He's a rather small bird, too small to account for the amount of terror he can author. He is seldom as large as a bantam hen, but his ability to raise his victim's blood pressure to near explosive levels is unparalleled in nature. The usual scenario generally involves something like what follows. The morning had been eventful. Elk were around in good numbers and had provided shot opportunities on a couple of occasions on smaller bulls. But it was early in the season, and I was holding out for something better, ignoring my long-standing tenet of never turn down on the first day what you would take on the last day. The vagaries of archery hunting for elk being what they were, one was never safe in the assumption that further chances would eventuate that would offer good shots. But I was adamant. I wanted a nice bull if I could get one. And if one always takes the small one first, he will never have the opportunity to take a large one. The sun was making brief appearances from time to time, and it had not rained in over 2 hours when I caught wind of elk nearby. It must be noted that elk, though beautiful, are not fastidious, and they do not bathe. Hence, they smell like a barnyard, and a large group of them smells like a large barnyard, and that is what I was catching now. The aroma of a group, properly called a gang, of elk somewhere very close. The terrain was flat and somewhat swampy, The timber was sparse, but regular in its growth. The main growth was the ubiquitous salal brush, Gaultheria shalom. Salal grows everywhere in this country and is, indeed, a major economic commodity in this area, as it is harvested and used in floral arrangements in the cities of the West. Entwined in this lush growth of salal is the scourge of Northwest loggers, Pacific blackberry, Rubus ursinus. There is just enough of it here to serve as a major tripping hazard, tying the hiker's legs securely to the ground as his body continues onward in his trek. The result is, often, a loud crash and a burst of profanity. The fact that this simple shrub is a major food source for the Columbian black-tailed deer that live here does little at this moment to redeem it in the eyes of the trippee. On this morning, I was especially careful of it. I was moving across this area of sparse timber most quietly, easing my way to where I might see the elk I was smelling. On and on I moved, step after silent step, from one tree to the next until at last I was seeing elk moving through the timber. There were several animals present, and I had seen at least one set of antlers through the trees. I was inching ever so much closer. Already I had passed up a small bull and some cows. The larger bull, now in full sight, was ahead. I was slowly closing the range on him. 50 yards. 40 yards. Nearer and nearer to the 25 yards to which my wooden recurve bow limited me. Just as I was to the point that I felt I might consider a shot, I took that one more step that is so often fatal. From out of the brush at my feet burst a small ball of feathers in the form of a ruffed grouse. He was mean enough to beat me mercifully with his wings as he made his ascent and his escape. If I could have maintained my composure, I could have caught him with my hat as he passed by. But, alas, such was not to be. One cannot imagine the amount of noise such a tiny creature can make with just his wings in the morning air. Add to that the fact that he was actually multiplying that by the factor of his wings actually beating me physically. Of course, by now, the elk were long gone, having no more desire to deal with the small tyrant than I had. But they had a clearer field in which to maneuver than I did, with my feet tied to the ground by blackberry vines. My heart was now in the proximity of my Adam's apple, and still on the rise. The air around me still blew from the expletive that managed to slip out while my mind was otherwise engaged with the problems of dealing with killer grouse. On a scale of 1 to 10 in meanness, that grouse had to rate at least a 12 or a 13. I did manage to survive that unmitigated attack, and even to take more elk in the future. But that didn't stay me from my newest sport, skewering grouse with my bow and arrow whenever the opportunity presented itself. My, they are tasty when grilled.
Thank you for the thumbprints, and thank you for the footprints, and thank you for the eyes shine over in the distance. Thank you for the hoots, and thank you for the hollers. Thank you for new friendship with the people who gather. The people who gather. The people who gather. Gabby still walks with us in spirit. There was just a wood knock, can you tell me, did you hear it? Gabby, we miss you more than ever. You're bombed with Barb. Continues forever. Continues forever. Continues forever. Yeah. Sasquatch all night long. Eat peanut butter at your gift inside, and listen to the hoot and all is all through the night.